The first thing my father said after I answered the phone was, "The bank's taking the house. What did you do?" His voice was sharp with panic, stripped of the cold authority he had used on me my whole life. In the background, I could hear my mother crying. Papers rustled. A television blared somewhere in the house. I remember smiling. Not because I was happy. Not because revenge had ever been something I dreamed about. But because for the first time in 42 years, Frank Reeves sounded afraid, and I wasn't the one standing there shaking. I quietly ended the call. Then I looked through the window of my motel room at the gray Virginia morning and let myself remember how all of it had started. It had begun exactly 1 week earlier. At 5:03 on a Monday morning, someone started pounding on my apartment door hard enough to rattle the brass unit number screwed into the frame. I woke instantly. 20 years in Army intelligence teaches you to wake fast. For a moment I thought I was back in Afghanistan, half asleep in a plywood bunk, while incoming alarms screamed through the dark. My heart slammed against my ribs before my mind caught up with where I was. Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Officer housing. Stateside. Safe. Then the pounding came again. Major Reeves Military Police, open the door. I was already out of bed, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. My apartment was neat, everything exactly where it belonged. Habit, discipline, order had shaped my life for more than 2 decades. I threw on a robe and opened the door. 2 MPs stood there in full uniform. Behind them was a man in civilian clothes holding a leather folder. The older MP avoided my eyes. That was my first warning. The civilian introduced himself as Special Agent Thomas Keating with Army Criminal Investigation Division. "Major Abigail Reeves," he said, his voice clipped and formal, "you are being placed under immediate administrative suspension, pending investigation into unauthorized access and transfer of classified financial intelligence records." For a moment the words didn't register. Unauthorized access. Transfer. I stared at him. There has to be some mistake. I'm afraid not. He handed me papers. Legal language blurred across the page. My security clearance was suspended effective immediately. My command authority was revoked pending investigation. I was prohibited from entering secure facilities or accessing military systems. It felt unreal, like hearing details from someone else's life. I had spent 21 years building my career. West Point. 2 overseas tours? Bronze Star. Countless nights under fluorescent lights tracking financial trails through hostile networks. And now some stranger was standing in my doorway dismantling all of it before sunrise. "I want my JAG representative." "You'll have one by 800. The younger MP shifted uncomfortably. He knew me. I recognized him too, Private Morales, fresh-faced kid from Texas. I'd once helped him get emergency leave when his father had a stroke. Now he stood there while another man confiscated my government-issued laptop and credentials. That was how quickly dignity can vanish. By 6:30, the rumors had already started. Military communities are small. News moves faster than wildfire. By 7, I had 3 texts from officers asking if the allegations were true. By 8, silence. No one wants proximity to disgrace. I sat in my apartment until 10, staring at my blank television screen. Then I did the one thing I hadn't done in years. I drove to my parents' house. They lived in Columbia, Maryland, in the same neat colonial home where I'd grown up. White shutters, blue hydrangeas, American flag hanging proudly from the porch. Frank Reeves believed deeply in appearances. A polished lawn meant discipline. Pressed shirts meant respectability. Children who succeeded reflected well on their parents. Children who stumbled were an embarrassment to be corrected. I had spent most of my life trying to earn his approval. Even West Point hadn't fully done it. He'd shaken my hand at graduation and said, "Not bad." That was the closest thing to pride I'd ever received. I pulled into their driveway just after noon. For a second, sitting there with my hands gripping the wheel, I was 16 again, hoping home would feel safe. I rang the bell. My mother answered. Elaine Reeves looked smaller than I remembered, softer somehow, her silver hair pinned neatly back. The moment she saw my face, her expression changed. Fear. Not concern. Fear. "Abby." "Mom, I need to talk to Dad." She hesitated. Then my father appeared behind her. Frank Reeves looked exactly as he always had, straight-backed iron gray hair, crisp button-down shirt tucked neatly into pressed slacks. Even retired, he dressed like the world was watching. His eyes landed on me, then narrowed. I saw the news. It isn't true. Military police don't show up for innocent people. I stared at him. Dad, I'm being framed. He folded his arms. You've brought enough shame to this family. The words landed harder than I expected. My mother looked down. Not defending me. Not saying my name. Just looking down. Then my father said the sentence I will never forget. Don't drag our family name down with you. I laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. Are you serious? Without answering, he stepped outside and dropped my old deployment duffel bag onto the porch. I stared at it. What is this? We cleared out the things you left here. Confusion hit me first. Then dread. I reached for my phone and opened my banking app. Balance $413.72. I froze. Number. No. The account had held nearly $80,000. Savings from deployments. Combat pay. Years of careful planning for retirement. My father had co-signed emergency access years ago before my first deployment in case something happened overseas. I looked up at him, my pulse roaring in my ears. You emptied my account. We protected family assets from seizure. My mouth went dry. That was my money. It was under our family name. Then he looked me straight in the eye and said, calm, as if discussing weather. Never use our family name again. My mother began crying quietly behind him. But she said nothing. And somehow that hurt more. I picked up my duffel. No shouting. No pleading. Military training teaches control. So I turned and walked back to my car. I drove south until Maryland disappeared in the rearview mirror. By nightfall, I checked into a roadside motel off I-95 with faded floral bedspreads and humming fluorescent lights. And for the first time since I was 18 years old, I had nowhere to go. That was the night I realized something harder than betrayal. Sometimes the people who abandon you were never really standing with you at all. The motel room smelled faintly of bleach and stale cigarette smoke. That smell stayed with me all week. Even now, months later, I sometimes catch a trace of disinfectant in a hospital hallway or an airport restroom, and I'm right back there sitting on the edge of that sagging mattress with my army duffel at my feet, staring at a future that had gone blank overnight. The first morning after my parents threw me out, I woke before dawn out of habit. For 21 years, reveille had been my clock, whether I was stationed in Virginia, South Korea, or halfway across a desert under blackout conditions. My body still expected purpose at 0500. Instead, there was only silence. No command schedule. No secure briefings. No morning reports waiting in my inbox. Just the buzz of the motel's ancient air conditioner and the sick feeling that my life had been paused by someone else's hand. I sat up slowly and reached for my phone. Nothing. No messages from command. No texts from colleagues. No calls from my parents. The isolation felt surgical, as if every thread connecting me to the world had been cut cleanly at once. For a while, I simply sat there and listened to the traffic passing on Interstate 95 beyond the window. Then discipline took over. I showered. Pressed my civilian clothes as neatly as I could. Made the bed. Small things. Order is often the only defense against panic. At 800 sharp, my temporary legal liaison called. Captain Laura Kim, Judge Advocate General's Corps. Her voice was professional but kind. Major Reeves, I've reviewed the preliminary allegations. And, a pause. This is unusual. That got my attention. How unusual. The access logs show your credentials authorized financial intelligence transfers at 02:17 hours last Thursday. I was asleep in my quarters. I know, base access logs confirm you never left your apartment. A quiet tension entered her voice. Someone either cloned your credentials or they had elevated system override access. I sat straighter. Which means this wasn't random. Number. For the first time since the MPS had appeared at my door, my fear sharpened into focus. I had spent years tracking financial fraud through military contracting systems. If someone had used my credentials to move classified financial records, they either wanted money Or they wanted me blamed for finding something I shouldn't have. Laura's voice lowered. Officially, I shouldn't say more, but unofficially, Major, this smells wrong. After we hung up, I stared at the wall for a long time. Then I opened my notebook. Paper, pen, old school. When systems are compromised, analog survives. I began writing every case I'd touched in the last 6 months. Defense vendors. Logistics contractors. Supply chain discrepancies. Payment irregularities. Halfway down page 3, one name stopped me cold. Redstone Federal Logistics. 3 months earlier, I had flagged unusual transaction layering through their overseas subcontractors. Nothing dramatic at first glance, just enough inconsistency to suggest laundering if someone knew where to look. I had submitted a recommendation for expanded audit review. 2 days later, I'd been told higher command would handle it. Then silence. Now I was under investigation. My instincts stirred. This wasn't coincidence. At noon, there was a knock at my motel door. Every muscle tightened. When I opened it, Colonel Daniel Mercer stood there holding 2 coffees. Retired 3 years now, Mercer had once been my commanding officer and the closest thing I'd ever had to a professional father. Tall and broad even in his 60s, with silver hair cropped short and eyes that missed nothing, he looked exactly as he had the day he pinned my oak leaves on my uniform. "You look terrible," he said. I almost laughed. That obvious? Abigail, I've interrogated cartel financiers with better posture. That made me smile despite myself. He handed me coffee and stepped inside. We sat by the window while morning traffic hissed past outside. He listened while I told him everything. The MPs. My parents. The missing money. Redstone. When I finished, he was quiet. Then he nodded slowly. I was afraid of this. My stomach tightened. You know something? Not enough to prove anything. He folded his hands. 3 weeks ago, a friend at the Pentagon called me. Internal oversight had concerns about procurement fraud tied to Redstone and several shell contractors. I felt my pulse quicken. How high does it go? High enough that if you got close to exposing it, someone would notice. The room felt smaller. You think I was set up? I think someone with system-level access used your credentials because they knew your audit flags would make you believable. He leaned forward. Listen carefully, Abigail. Truth in Washington moves slow, but it always leaves footprints. That sentence settled into me like an anchor. For the first time all week, I could breathe. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't disgraced. I was inconvenient. And inconvenient people get erased if they stop paying attention. After Mercer left, I worked. Not officially. Not on any military system. But I knew enough about contractor reporting structures to map likely shell pathways by hand. Hours passed. Outside daylight faded to dusk. Around 7, my phone buzzed. Dad. I stared at his name. Frank Reeves had not called once to ask if I was safe. Not once. Now his name glowed across my screen like a command. I let it ring out. A minute later, voicemail. Then another call. Another voicemail. By midnight, there were 6. I didn't listen. Not yet. Instead, I sat by the motel window and watched headlights sweep across the parking lot. Somewhere out there, powerful people thought they had buried me. At the same time, somewhere north in Maryland, my father was calling with growing urgency. For reasons I didn't yet understand, both sides had suddenly remembered I existed. And experience had taught me one thing. When people who've ignored you suddenly need your attention, the truth is usually about to surface. I slept with my notebook open beside me. And for the first time since military police had pounded on my door, I dreamed not of losing everything, but of getting it back. The 7th call came at 6:14 the next morning. I was already awake, sitting at the little motel desk with my notebook open and a stale cup of coffee cooling beside me. Dawn was creeping through the thin curtains, laying pale stripes across the carpet. Dad's name flashed across my screen again. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Then I answered, "Hello." The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to tell me he hadn't expected me to pick up. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded nothing like the cold, polished certainty I had grown up fearing. It was ragged. Panicked. "Abigail." "Not Abby." Not that clipped, dismissive tone he used whenever he wanted to remind me I'd disappointed him. My full name. Like he suddenly remembered I was a person. "What is it, Dad?" There was a sharp breath. Then he blurted, "The bank's taking the house." I said nothing. Behind him I could hear my mother crying. Cabinet doors opening and closing. The low murmur of the television. Then his voice sharpened into accusation. "What did you do?" For a moment I didn't understand what he meant. Then memory clicked into place. 7 years earlier, right before my second deployment overseas, my parents had asked me to help them refinance. Dad had framed it as temporary, a smart financial adjustment while interest rates were favorable. "Just co-sign," he'd said. "It'll help secure approval. You've got stable military income." I had signed without hesitation. Because he was my father. Because family was supposed to mean trust. What I hadn't known, what I had never thought to check, was that after the refinance, he had quietly tied the mortgage autopay to the emergency account he had access to. My account. The account he had emptied the day he threw me out. The realization settled slowly. Heavy. Clean. The money that had kept their house afloat had been mine all along. And when he drained it to protect family assets, he'd severed his own lifeline. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the motel wall. On the other end, my father was breathing hard. "Well," he snapped. For most of my life, that tone would have sent adrenaline through me, the reflexive need to explain, obey, fix whatever he believed I had broken. But something inside me had shifted on that porch in Maryland. Some old chain had finally snapped. I smiled. Not cruelly. Not triumphantly. Just with the quiet recognition of truth finally arriving exactly where it belonged. Then I ended the call. No speech. No accusation. No explanation. Just silence. The phone buzzed again immediately. I muted it and set it face down. Outside, the Virginia sky was turning gold with sunrise. For the first time in days, I felt calm. Not vindicated. Not healed. Just clear. Some lessons don't need to be taught with anger. Reality usually handles that part just fine. I showered, dressed, and walked across the motel parking lot to the little diner next door. The waitress, a woman in her 60s named Sharon, had started recognizing me by then. She poured coffee before I even sat down. "Rough week." I gave a tired smile. "You could say that." She nodded like she understood more than she asked. That's something I've always admired about older Americans. The best of them know when kindness matters more than curiosity. I was halfway through my eggs when the television above the counter switched from local weather to national news. The headline froze me in place. Pentagon procurement fraud investigation expands. The anchor's voice sharpened. Sources inside the Department of Defense now confirm widening inquiries into financial irregularities tied to Redstone Federal Logistics and affiliated contractors. My pulse kicked. Sharon noticed. "You okay, honey?" I didn't answer. On-screen file footage rolled of Redstone executives entering a federal building. Then my own photograph appeared. My official army portrait. The diner went very still. The anchor continued. Earlier reports suggested Major Abigail Reeves was under investigation for unauthorized system access. New information indicates Reeves may instead be central to uncovering the fraud itself. The room blurred for a second. I gripped the edge of the booth. The anchor kept speaking. Military investigators are now examining evidence that Major Reeves's credentials were duplicated by senior systems administrators linked to contractor oversight offices. A man at the counter turned and stared at me. Recognition dawned. I stood slowly. Then my phone exploded with notifications. Texts. Voicemails. News alerts. 27 missed calls. Most from numbers I knew. Former colleagues. Reporters. And my parents. The phone rang again. Dad. I let it ring. Again. Again. Then voicemail. I listened. His voice had changed. Gone was the accusation. Gone was the command. Now there was something almost unrecognizable. Fear and shame. "Abby," he said quietly, "please call us back. We didn't know." I stared at the message long after it ended. Then Colonel Mercer called. His voice was steady. They've arrested 2 oversight officials and frozen Redstone assets. I closed my eyes. It's over. Not quite. A pause. Then warmth entered his tone. But your name's been cleared, Major, officially. For a moment I couldn't breathe. 21 years of service. A lifetime spent proving myself. And now, in one sentence, my honor had been returned. I thought I'd feel triumph. Instead, I felt grief. For the child who had spent decades chasing her father's approval. For the woman standing on that porch while her family turned her away. For all the years I had mistaken endurance for love. Mercer spoke again. You all right? I looked out the diner window at the brightening Virginia morning. And for the first time in my life I answered honestly. Yes. I think I finally am. By noon, every major news network in the country had my face on their screens. It was a strange thing watching your own army portrait appear beneath a chyron that read, Decorated Officer Cleared in Pentagon Fraud Case. I sat in the same diner booth where an hour earlier I had been a disgraced major hiding in plain sight. Now Sharon kept refilling my coffee while pretending not to stare. The regulars at the counter stole glances in my direction, their expressions shifting from curiosity to recognition to something like respect. I wasn't used to public attention. Military intelligence is built on invisibility. If people know your name, something has usually gone wrong. And for one long week, everything had. Now the truth was surfacing faster than anyone expected. The television anchor explained how investigators had uncovered an internal network of procurement fraud stretching through multiple oversight offices. Redstone Federal Logistics had funneled federal money through shell contractors for years. When I flagged irregularities in their overseas payment structures, 2 senior civilian administrators intercepted my audit requests. Then they cloned my credentials, falsified access logs, and used my profile as a scapegoat. The whole operation had nearly worked. Nearly. But one of the men they trusted, a systems analyst named Victor Salinas, had panicked after seeing how far they intended to push the cover-up. He had turned state's evidence before dawn. His testimony had broken everything open. By 11:30 that morning, federal agents had made arrests in Arlington and Washington. By noon, my suspension was formally lifted. At 12:14, my commanding general called personally. Lieutenant General Howard Whitaker was not a man known for softness. He had spent 37 years becoming exactly the kind of officer history books remember. His voice came through measured and precise. Major Reeves. Sir. A pause. Then, you have my apology. The words landed harder than I expected. I appreciate that, sir. No, he said quietly, you deserved better. I stared at the motel wallpaper while emotion tightened my throat. That was the thing about real leadership. It doesn't hide behind rank when it's wrong. Whitaker continued. You'll report to Fort Belvoir at 800 tomorrow in full dress uniform. There will be a formal reinstatement and commendation. Yes, sir. Another pause. Then his tone softened. Well done, Major. The line clicked dead. For several moments I simply sat there holding the phone. 21 years of service had taught me that praise from men like Whitaker was rare and carefully earned. But all I felt was tired. Deep down tired. The kind that settles into your bones after surviving something your mind still hasn't caught up to. The next call came 3 minutes later. Mom. I let it ring. Then voicemail. Her voice was shaking. Abby, sweetheart, please call us. We were wrong. We didn't understand. A sob interrupted her. Then the message ended. I closed my eyes. The old ache rose instantly. That familiar pull to comfort her. To smooth over pain. To become the capable daughter who fixed everyone else's mistakes. But another voice quieter and stronger rose beside it. You do not owe people immediate access just because they suddenly regret hurting you. That truth felt foreign. Almost rebellious. And yet it steadied me. The calls continued all afternoon. Dad. Mom. Dad again. A text. Please, we need to talk. Another. The foreclosure notice was a mistake. There's more going on. Please call. I ignored them all. At 5 that evening, Colonel Mercer arrived at the motel. He wore jeans and a navy polo shirt, but somehow still looked like he was conducting command inspection. He handed me a garment bag. Inside was my dress blues. Pressed perfectly. Every ribbon aligned. Every insignia polished. I looked up. You had these cleaned, he shrugged. Thought you might need them. That nearly broke me. Not because of the uniform. Because he had noticed what I needed before I asked. That kind of quiet care still catches me off guard. Mercer sat across from me. You heard from your parents? I nodded. And, I don't know. He was silent for a while. Then he said something I've carried with me ever since. Abigail, forgiveness and access are not the same thing. I looked at him. He folded his hands. You can forgive someone someday and still refuse to let them keep hurting you today. The words settled somewhere deep. I thought about my father standing on that porch. About my mother looking away. About 20 years of trying to become enough for people who only measured worth by usefulness. And for the first time I considered a possibility I had never allowed myself before. Maybe I didn't need their approval to belong to myself. That night alone in the motel room, I carefully hung my uniform on the closet door. The dark blue fabric caught the yellow lamplight. Brass buttons gleamed. Rows of ribbons marked 2 decades of service, sacrifice, and endurance. For years I had worn that uniform, hoping my father might one day see it and understand my worth. Now I understood something better. Its value had never depended on his recognition. At 7:42 the phone rang again. Dad. This time I answered. He inhaled sharply. Abigail. His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I said nothing. Then he spoke the words I never thought Frank Reeves would say. I was wrong. Silence stretched between us. Then quietly, I should have trusted my daughter. Something inside me shifted. Not healed. Not whole. But softened. And for the first time since this began, I wondered if shame had finally reached him the way fear never could. I didn't forgive him that night. But I listened. And sometimes listening is the first crack where grace begins to enter. The next morning I stood in front of the motel mirror and buttoned my dress blues, one careful fastening at a time. The motions were automatic. Precise. Familiar. For 21 years this uniform had marked every turning point of my adult life. Promotions. Deployments. Funerals. Homecomings. Victories no civilian would ever hear about. And now somehow it marked this too. Reclamation. I adjusted the ribbons across my chest and looked at my reflection. The woman staring back looked older than she had 2 weeks earlier. Not physically. Something deeper. As though betrayal had burned away the last traces of someone who still believed love could be earned through performance. Outside, Virginia's early sunlight spilled across the motel parking lot. Colonel Mercer was waiting beside his truck, coffee in hand. He looked me over and gave one sharp nod. About time the Army remembered who you are. That made me smile. The drive to Fort Belvoir was quiet. Mercer understood the value of silence. Older soldiers know that some moments deserve room to settle. When we reached post, military police waved us through the gate with formal salutes. A week earlier, another set of MPS had stripped my authority at my apartment door. Now those same gates opened to welcome me back. Life has a way of restoring balance when truth finally catches up. The ceremony was held in the command auditorium. Nothing extravagant. 100 seats. Flags arranged at the front. Rows of officers and civilian staff already seated when I entered. The room rose as one. For a moment I stopped walking. I hadn't expected that. General Whitaker stood near the podium. He met my eyes and gave the slightest nod. It wasn't ceremony. It was respect. I moved forward and took my place. The general's remarks were brief and direct. He spoke about duty, integrity, the cost of institutional failure when good people are doubted too quickly. Then he turned toward me. Major Abigail Reeves acted exactly as an officer should. Her vigilance exposed one of the most serious procurement fraud operations this command has seen in decades. His voice sharpened. We failed her before verifying the truth. That failure will not happen again. The room was utterly still. Then he pinned the Legion of Merit medal to my jacket. As his hand withdrew, he said quietly enough that only I could hear, "You honored the uniform better than we honored you." Emotion rose so suddenly I nearly lost my composure. But Army discipline held. I saluted. He returned it. The applause that followed was long and steady. And all I could think was this. My father had spent 40 years teaching me that approval had to be earned through perfection. Yet here among people who had every reason to judge harshly acknowledgement had arrived not because I was flawless, but because I had endured truthfully. After the ceremony, officers approached one by one. Some apologized. Some simply shook my hand. Others said nothing at all, their expressions carrying more sincerity than words ever could. Then I saw my phone. 32 missed calls. 20 from my parents. One voicemail had arrived during the ceremony. I stepped into an empty hallway and played it. Dad's voice came through rough and uneven. "Abigail, the sheriff posted final foreclosure papers this morning." A shaky breath followed. "We have 48 hours. Silence." Then, "I know I don't deserve to ask this, but your mother's terrified." His voice cracked. And suddenly, impossibly, I heard not the commanding father of my childhood, but an aging man confronting consequences he no longer knew how to control. He continued, "I was wrong about everything." A pause. Then the sentence that undid me. "I was so afraid of being ashamed of you, I never noticed how proud I should have been." The voicemail ended. I stood there staring at the blank screen. For years, those were the words I had wanted. A child can survive on very little hope if she believes love is still possible. And now here they were arriving decades late and spoken through defeat. Colonel Mercer found me standing there. He read my expression immediately. "What happened?" I handed him the phone. He listened quietly. When it ended, he looked up. "What are you thinking?" I stared down the long, polished hallway of Fort Belvoir, at young officers walking briskly toward work, at the life I had fought to reclaim. Then I answered honestly, "I think I'm tired of letting pain make my decisions." Mercer said nothing. He didn't need to. By afternoon, I was driving north to Maryland. The highway stretched ahead beneath a pale autumn sky. Every mile carried memory. Family road trips. High school debates with my father. The long drive home after West Point graduation when he had said, "Not bad," like it was praise enough to last a lifetime. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, dusk had settled. The foreclosure notice was taped to the front door. The American flag still hung neatly from the porch. But the house itself looked smaller somehow. Fragile. Like pride had been the only thing holding it upright. I stepped out of the car. And for the first time in my life, I approached that front door with nothing left to prove. The porch light was already on when I walked up the front steps. For a second, my hand hovered over the same brass doorbell I had pressed a week earlier. That morning, I had stood here frightened, disgraced, and desperate for comfort. Tonight, I stood here restored. Not because the army had cleared my name. Not because the uniform on my shoulders carried fresh recognition. But because somewhere between losing everything and getting it back, I had stopped measuring my worth by whether this door opened for me. I pressed the bell. Footsteps shuffled inside. Then the door opened. My father looked smaller than I remembered. Frank Reeves had always filled a room through sheer force of certainty. Even in retirement, he carried himself like a man who believed control was his birthright. That certainty was gone now. His shoulders sagged. His neatly combed gray hair looked thinner. The skin beneath his eyes had hollowed into shadows. And when he saw me standing there in full dress blues, his face folded in on itself. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he stepped aside. "Please come in." The house smelled exactly as it had my entire childhood lemon-polish old books and my mother's lavender hand soap. The familiarity hit harder than I expected. Memory is a strange thing. It can ache even when attached to pain. Mom stood in the living room near the fireplace, twisting a handkerchief between trembling fingers. The moment she saw me, tears spilled down her cheeks. "Abby," I gave a small nod. Not cold, not warm, simply present. She crossed the room and stopped a few feet away as though uncertain she had the right to come closer. That hurt more than anger would have, because it meant she knew what she'd done. We sat in the living room where I had opened Christmas gifts as a child and studied for SAT exams under my father's stern supervision. Now silence filled every corner. Finally, Dad spoke. The bank accelerated the foreclosure after Redstone's assets were frozen. I frowned. What does Redstone have to do with your mortgage? His expression tightened. Then shame darkened his face. Years seemed to settle into him all at once. He looked suddenly old. 3 years ago, he said quietly, I invested our retirement funds with a private equity group. A sick feeling stirred in my stomach. He kept going. They promised stable returns, conservative growth. They were backed through Redstone affiliates. Of course they were. Contractor shell money laundering often flowed through respectable-looking retirement instruments. For older investors, it was a familiar trap trust, the polished men with brochures and percentages. Dad stared at his hands. When your account became accessible, I used it to cover our mortgage while waiting for the investments to recover. I felt something inside me go still. Not rage. Not even shock. Just clarity. For years, he had quietly depended on my money while presenting himself as the provider. The man who had lectured me about responsibility had been surviving on my sacrifices while calling it family stewardship. Mom's voice broke through. I knew some of it. I looked at her. She wept openly now. I told myself he'd fix it. I told myself families help each other. But I knew it wasn't right. There it was. The truth at last. Not monsters. Not villains. Just frightened people whose pride had slowly made cowards of them. Dad looked up at me then, and his voice cracked. I emptied your account because I panicked. He swallowed hard. When the military investigation hit the news, I thought everything would be seized. I thought if I protected what was left. What was left, I asked quietly. He flinched. The question hung there. What was left after years of taking from a daughter he had never truly seen? Tears filled his eyes. The sight stunned me. Frank Reeves did not cry. Not when his own father died. Not when Mom survived breast cancer. Not when I deployed to Afghanistan. But now tears slipped down his face unchecked. And he whispered the words I never thought I would hear. I threw away my child to save a house and still lost both. The room went silent. I looked at this man who had shaped so much of my life through absence disguised as discipline. And for the first time I saw him clearly. Not as the giant whose approval I had chased. Not as the judge whose standards defined me. Just an aging man who had spent his life worshipping control until it cost him the very people he meant to protect. And suddenly I pitied him. Real pity. Not contempt. Not triumph. Mercy. I stood. Both of them looked up frightened I was leaving. Instead, I walked to the front window and looked out at the dark street where I'd once learned to ride a bicycle under my father's watchful eye. Then I turned back. I can stop the foreclosure. Neither of them moved. Dad's face drained of color. Why? It was a fair question. After everything, why? I thought about Colonel Mercer's words. Forgiveness and access are not the same thing. Then I answered. Because if I let bitterness decide who I become, then this wins twice. Mom covered her mouth and sobbed. Dad stared at me like he no longer recognized the daughter standing before him. Maybe he didn't. The frightened girl who once begged for scraps of his approval was gone. In her place stood a woman who had finally learned this. Mercy offered freely is not weakness. It is freedom. The next morning I wired enough money to halt proceedings. Not to erase the past. Not to pretend trust was restored overnight, but to make room for something better than revenge. That evening, after the paperwork cleared, Dad met me at the front door as I prepared to leave. His eyes were red. His hands shook slightly. For a moment he said nothing. Then very softly he spoke my full name. Welcome home, Abigail Reeves. Not ownership. Not expectation. Just pride. At last freely given. I smiled. And this time when he opened his arms I stepped into them. Some wounds never fully disappear. But healing begins the moment we stop asking pain to tell us who we are. If this story stirred something in your heart, if you've ever had to choose grace when anger felt easier, I hope you'll carry that reflection with you, and perhaps share it with someone who needs it. And if stories like this remind you that it's never too late for truth healing and second chances, I'd be honored if you stayed for the next one. The ballroom went silent the moment I stepped through the doors. More than 200 people turned to look at me. Business executives, investors, employees, board members, and standing in the center of the room holding a champagne glass was my husband. Beside him stood a woman wearing a diamond necklace I had received on our 25th wedding anniversary, a necklace that was supposed to be locked inside my jewelry box at home. The woman smiled confidently until she saw me. Then the color drained from her face. My husband looked like he'd seen a ghost. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Who is that?" I straightened my shoulders inside my army dress uniform. 32 years of military service had taught me many things. How to stay calm under pressure. How to read people. How to wait patiently until the right moment. I looked directly at the woman, then at my husband. And finally I said the words that changed everything. "Hello, David." The room grew even quieter. "I'm Rebecca Carter." I paused. The actual Mrs. Carter. A champagne glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered on the floor. And in that moment, the carefully constructed lie my husband had been living for years began to collapse. But before I tell you how I ended up standing in that ballroom, I need to take you back 3 weeks. Back to the day I came home. I had spent 11 months overseas. At 58 years old, I was serving as a colonel in the United States Army and nearing retirement. Most people my age were planning vacations, spending time with grandchildren, or learning how to enjoy slower mornings. I was coordinating military operations halfway around the world. It wasn't glamorous. Mostly it was paperwork planning and responsibility. But I had always believed in service. And for more than 3 decades, my husband David had always claimed he believed in it too. Whenever I apologized for missing holidays or anniversaries, he would smile and tell me not to worry. "We both serve in different ways," he'd say. "You serve the country. I'll keep things running at home." For years I believed him. Maybe that's why what happened hurt so much, not because of the betrayal itself, but because I never saw it coming. 3 weeks earlier, I received unexpected leave approval. My replacement arrived sooner than anticipated, which meant I could return to Texas almost a month earlier than planned. I decided not to tell David. I wanted to surprise him. The idea seemed romantic, old-fashioned maybe. The kind of thing married couples still did after 30 years together. I imagined showing up at his office, his face lighting up, a long embrace. Maybe dinner at our favorite steakhouse afterward. Simple things. The things you miss when you're away long enough. My flight landed at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport on a bright Thursday morning. The Texas sun felt warmer than I remembered. I carried only a small bag and wore my army dress uniform because I was scheduled to attend a military ceremony the following day. Instead of heading home first, I called a rideshare and gave the driver the address of David's company, Carter Logistics Solutions, a business we had built together from almost nothing. Back in the early years, I had helped with bookkeeping on weekends while serving active duty. Every promotion I earned in the Army had also helped create opportunities for his growing business. We were partners, or at least I thought we were. The company headquarters occupied a modern 4-story building in a business district north of Dallas. As we pulled into the parking lot, I felt butterflies in my stomach. I remember laughing at myself. After 30 years of marriage, I was still nervous about surprising my husband. The driver dropped me off near the front entrance. I straightened my uniform jacket and walked toward the security desk. The guard looked to be in his late 20s, friendly enough. He smiled politely. "Good morning, ma'am." "Morning," I said. "I'm here to surprise my husband." "Name?" "Rebecca Carter." He typed something into his computer, then glanced up. "Who are you meeting?" I smiled. "David Carter." The guard nodded. "And your relationship to Mr. Carter?" I actually laughed. "I'm his wife." The reaction caught me completely off guard. The young man laughed too. Not rudely at first. More like someone who thought he'd heard a joke. Then he shook his head. "Good one." I frowned. "I'm sorry." The guard leaned back in his chair. "Ma'am, the boss's wife is already inside." For a moment, I honestly thought I'd misunderstood him. "The what?" "The boss's wife." He pointed toward the executive elevators. "She's here almost every day." I stared at him. My mind struggled to process what he was saying. Then he added the sentence that changed everything. "There she is now." I turned. A woman in her 40s stepped out of the elevator lobby. Elegant dress, perfect hair, expensive handbag. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Several employees greeted her as she walked past. One man even said, "Morning, Mrs. Carter." "Mrs. Carter." My name, my title, my life. The woman smiled and continued walking toward the parking lot. The security guard looked back at me. See, my stomach tightened. I should have marched straight upstairs. Demanded answers. Created a scene, but military training kicked in. When something doesn't make sense, you don't react emotionally. You gather information. Observe first. Act second. I forced myself to smile. Interesting. The guard shrugged. Sorry about the misunderstanding. I nodded politely. Then I walked back outside. The Texas heat hit me immediately. I sat down on a bench near the parking lot and watched the woman drive away. For nearly 20 minutes I remained there, thinking, breathing, trying to understand what I had just witnessed. The obvious explanation was an affair, but somehow it felt bigger than that. Employees weren't acting like she was a secret girlfriend. They genuinely believed she was Mrs. Carter, which meant this wasn't new. This had been happening for a while. A long while. I pulled out my phone. David had texted me 2 days earlier. Miss you. Can't wait until you come home. Love you. I stared at the message. Then I looked back at the building. For the first time in our marriage, I wondered if I actually knew the man who had sent it. I stood up slowly. I wasn't ready to go home. Not yet. Instead, I booked a room at a nearby hotel. Because something told me that if I wanted the truth, I needed to stop being a wife for a little while and start thinking like an investigator. The moment I checked into that hotel room, I made a decision. I would not call David. I would not confront him. Not yet. Instead, I was going to find out exactly who that woman was, and why half of Dallas seemed to believe she was living my life. The first night in that hotel room, I barely slept. Not because I was angry. At least not yet. Anger requires certainty. And at that point, all I had were questions. I sat beside the window overlooking the Dallas skyline and replayed the scene at the security desk over and over. The guard hadn't looked nervous. He hadn't been covering for anyone. He genuinely believed the woman he pointed to was David Carter's wife. That was the part I couldn't shake. Affairs happen. I've lived long enough to know that. Military life puts enormous pressure on marriages. Long deployments. Missed birthdays. Empty chairs at family dinners. I've seen good marriages survive it and good marriages collapse under it. But what I'd witnessed wasn't simply infidelity. It was something stranger, more deliberate. Somehow another woman had stepped into my place so completely that people accepted her as Mrs. Carter, and nobody seemed to question it, not even for a second. The next morning I started doing what the Army had trained me to do for more than 30 years. Gather information. Patiently. Methodically. Without assumptions. I changed into civilian clothes and drove back to the company headquarters. This time I parked across the street. For nearly 4 hours I sat inside a coffee shop with a view of the entrance. I watched employees arrive. I watched deliveries come and go. And around 9:30 I saw her. The woman. She arrived in a black Mercedes. A valet rushed to open her door. Several employees greeted her warmly. One even carried her handbag inside. Nobody treated her like a visitor. They treated her like family. Like she belonged. Like she was the boss's wife. Over the next 3 days, I continued watching. The pattern became impossible to ignore. She attended executive meetings, joined David for lunches, accompanied him to charity functions, walked through the building with complete authority. Everywhere she went, people called her Mrs. Carter. Not once did anyone correct themselves. Not once did anyone hesitate. It was as if I had never existed. On the 4th day, I decided to dig deeper. I started with social media. That alone nearly broke my heart. Photos. Hundreds of them. Fundraisers. Business dinners. Golf tournaments. Holiday parties. In photo after photo, David and the woman appeared together, standing side by side, smiling, posing, looking exactly like a married couple. Comments underneath the pictures were even worse. What a beautiful couple. You two are relationship goals. Mrs. Carter looks amazing. Nobody questioned it. Nobody knew. Or perhaps nobody cared. I stared at those images for hours. I wasn't jealous. At 58, jealousy felt like a young person's emotion. What I felt was something else. Erasure. As though the last 3 decades of my life had simply been deleted. That evening I called my oldest friend, Margaret. We'd met 27 years earlier at Fort Bragg. She retired as a lieutenant colonel and now lived outside San Antonio. Margaret answered on the second ring. Rebecca. Hey. The moment she heard my voice, she knew something was wrong. What happened? I hesitated. Then I told her everything. The security guard. The woman. The photographs. The lies. By the time I finished, there was a long silence. Finally, Margaret spoke. You're sure? I wish I wasn't. Another silence. Then she said something that stayed with me. Don't confront him. That's exactly what I was thinking. Good. I need facts. You always do. We both laughed softly. For the first time all week, I felt a little less alone. The next morning, Margaret connected me with another retired officer, a former military investigator named Frank Lawson. Frank was 72 years old and sharp as ever. After listening carefully, he asked only one question. "Rebecca, do you believe this is only an affair?" I thought about it. "No, neither do I." That answer surprised me. "Why?" Frank sighed. "Because affairs thrive on secrecy." "What does that mean?" "It means people hide them." I knew where he was going. "This woman isn't hidden." "Exactly." He paused. "Someone wanted her seen." The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. David wasn't merely cheating. He was presenting her as his wife, publicly, openly, repeatedly, for years. A few days later, I finally learned her name. Vanessa Morgan, 43 years old, former marketing consultant, divorced, no children. I found her listed as a board advisor for several local charities. Interestingly, many of those charities also received donations from David's company. The connections were growing, and I didn't like what I was seeing. Then came the discovery that changed everything. One of my former neighbors called me unexpectedly. Karen had lived across the street from us for nearly 15 years. We hadn't spoken in months. After a few minutes of catching up, she asked a question that made my blood run cold. "So when did you move out?" I nearly dropped the phone. "What?" "You and David." "What are you talking about?" There was a long pause. Karen sounded confused. "I assumed you moved." "Why?" "Because another woman has been staying there." I felt my heart pounding. "How long?" Another pause. Then she answered, "At least 2 years." 2 years? Not 2 months. Not 6 months. 2 years. I closed my eyes. The room suddenly felt very small. For 2 years, another woman had been walking into my home, sleeping in my bed, using my kitchen, hosting dinners in the house I helped pay for, and all while I was serving overseas. That night I drove past my own house. I parked across the street. The same way I had watched The Office. The lights were on. A familiar porch light glowed beside the front door. The flower beds I had planted years earlier still lined the walkway. Everything looked exactly the same, yet somehow it wasn't my home anymore. At around 8:30, David's SUV pulled into the driveway. A few minutes later, Vanessa came outside. She kissed him. Casually, comfortably, like she'd done it 1,000 times. Then they went inside together. I sat there for nearly an hour, not crying, not screaming, just watching, accepting reality. Sometimes the truth arrives all at once. Sometimes it arrives one painful piece at a time. For me, it was happening piece by piece, and each piece hurt more than the last. Back at the hotel, I spread documents, notes, and photographs across the bed. There was enough evidence now to prove David had built an entirely separate life, but something still bothered me. Something didn't add up. A successful businessman doesn't risk everything for an affair. Not unless there's something bigger behind it. Something financial. Something hidden. The next morning I called a family attorney I had trusted for years. Her name was Lisa Reynolds. After hearing everything, she asked me to come to her office immediately. When I arrived, she listened quietly and reviewed my notes. Then she leaned back in her chair. "Rebecca, I think we need to examine the company's finances." I frowned. "Why?" Lisa folded her hands together. "Because people willing to lie this long about one thing," she paused, "are often lying about other things too." As I left her office that afternoon, I had a feeling my marriage wasn't the only thing about to fall apart. And deep down, I was beginning to suspect that David's betrayal went far beyond another woman. The following Monday morning, I sat across from Lisa Reynolds in her downtown Dallas office. The building overlooked a busy stretch of freeway where thousands of people were heading to work, worrying about deadlines, meetings, and ordinary problems. I envied them. A week earlier, I had been worried about whether David would like the surprise I had planned. Now I was trying to determine whether my husband had spent years dismantling the life we'd built together. Lisa slid a legal pad across the desk. "Let's start with everything you jointly own." For the next 2 hours, we reviewed our finances. The house, retirement accounts, investments, business interests, savings, things I hadn't thought about in years. David had always handled most of the company's financial operations, not because I couldn't, simply because marriage requires trust, or at least it should. I trusted him, the same way he trusted me to protect his life when I carried a weapon overseas, the same way he trusted me to represent our family while serving in uniform. Trust isn't supposed to be complicated. That's why betrayal hurts so much. By Wednesday, Lisa had assigned a forensic accountant to review publicly available records connected to Carter Logistics Solutions. His name was Michael Bennett, a quiet man in his 60s with reading glasses that constantly slid down his nose. He reminded me of a favorite high school teacher, the kind who notices details everyone else misses. When we met for the first time, he carried 3 thick folders. That immediately concerned me. 3 folders meant work. A lot of work. Michael sat down, opened the first folder, and sighed. Colonel Carter. I hadn't heard that title spoken in days. For some reason, it comforted me. Yes, I think you have a much bigger problem than an affair. My stomach tightened. Show me. For the next hour, Michael walked me through a complicated web of transactions. Some were small, others weren't. Large consulting fees, questionable vendor contracts, property purchases, corporate transfers. At first glance, everything appeared legitimate. But once Michael began connecting the dots, a disturbing picture emerged. Money was moving. A lot of money. And much of it seemed connected to Vanessa Morgan. I stared at the documents. How much are we talking about? Michael adjusted his glasses. Potentially several $1 million. The room suddenly felt colder. Several million. Not thousands. Not hundreds of thousands. Millions. I had expected heartbreak. I had expected lies. I had not expected financial betrayal on this scale. The deeper we looked, the worse it became. Several companies receiving payments from Carter Logistics appeared to have connections to Vanessa. One was registered under a former business partner of hers. Another listed an address tied to a family member. A third had virtually no business activity at all. Yet money continued flowing into it. Month after month. Year after year. Lisa leaned forward. David knew exactly what he was doing. I nodded slowly. There was no other explanation. These weren't mistakes. They were decisions. Careful, intentional, calculated decisions. What hurt most wasn't the money. At 58 years old, I'd learned that money comes and goes. You can lose a house, lose investments, lose possessions. What truly hurts is discovering someone you love has been lying while looking directly into your eyes. That's harder to recover from. A few days later, Michael uncovered another troubling detail. David had recently begun restructuring ownership percentages within the company. The timing caught everyone's attention, especially Lisa's. She reviewed the paperwork several times before speaking. When were you supposed to return from deployment? About 3 weeks from now. She nodded. Interesting. What is... Lisa turned the documents toward me. These transfers were scheduled to continue over the next 6 months. I studied the dates. A cold realization settled over me. David thought he still had time. He believed I was overseas. He believed I wouldn't be back yet. Which meant he had been in the middle of something when I unexpectedly arrived home. Something unfinished. Something important. That weekend, another piece of the puzzle appeared. An old friend called me. His name was Jim Harper. He had worked for David for nearly 15 years before retiring. I'd always liked Jim. Steady. Honest. The kind of man who still mailed handwritten Christmas cards. When he heard I was back in Texas, he asked to meet for coffee. We chose a diner near Plano. Nothing fancy. Just eggs, coffee, and quiet conversation. After a few minutes of small talk, Jim grew serious. I almost didn't call. Why? He looked uncomfortable. Because I wasn't sure how much you knew. Knew about what? He stared into his coffee, then finally answered. Things changed after you deployed. My heart sank. What kind of things? Jim sighed. A lot of longtime employees left. That surprised me. David had always valued loyalty, or at least I thought he had. Why? Jim shook his head. Most weren't fired. Then what happened? They were pushed out. I frowned. By who? He looked directly at me. Vanessa. For nearly an hour, Jim told me stories. Employees with decades of experience suddenly finding themselves excluded from meetings. Trusted managers being replaced. Longtime staff members resigning after conflicts with Vanessa. People who questioned her authority mysteriously disappearing from leadership positions. The pattern repeated itself again and again. Loyal employees were removed. Supporters were promoted. Little by little, Vanessa's influence grew. And David allowed it. Maybe even encouraged it. Then Jim shared something that cut deeper than everything else. Something I still remember word for word. We had finished eating. The waitress had refilled our coffee. Jim hesitated before speaking. I probably shouldn't tell you this. Tell me anyway. He looked away. David used to make jokes. I felt a knot form in my chest. What kind of jokes? Jim swallowed, then quietly answered. He'd say his wife loved the army more than she loved her marriage. For a moment I couldn't speak, not because I was shocked, because I was hurt, deeply hurt. I had missed birthdays, anniversaries, vacations, family gatherings, not because I wanted to, because service required sacrifice. David knew that. He had supported that, or at least I believed he had. To hear that he had mocked those sacrifices behind my back felt worse than the affair itself, worse than the money, worse than the lies, because it meant he had rewritten our story, the story we'd spent 30 years building together. That night I sat alone in my hotel room. A photograph rested on the nightstand, one I had carried overseas. David and I standing together at my promotion ceremony years earlier. He had looked proud, genuinely proud, or maybe I had imagined it. Now I wasn't sure. I picked up the photograph and studied it for a long time, trying to figure out when everything changed, trying to identify the exact moment my husband stopped being my partner and became someone I no longer recognized. I never found the answer. The following week, Lisa called with news. We're ready. I looked up from my notes. Ready for what? The next step. I knew exactly what she meant. For nearly 2 weeks we had gathered evidence, documents, financial records, witness statements, corporate filings, photographs, everything. Piece by piece we had assembled the truth, and now the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Lisa's voice remained calm. Rebecca, if we're going to do this, we need to do it properly. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I agree. David still doesn't know you're here. No? Good. That single word carried enormous weight. Good. Because surprise had become my greatest advantage. David thought I was thousands of miles away. He thought his secrets were safe. He thought he still controlled the narrative. What he didn't realize was that the evidence against him was already stacked neatly inside several folders sitting on my hotel desk. And very soon those folders were going to be opened in front of people whose opinions mattered far more than mine. People with the power to destroy everything he'd spent years trying to protect. The trap wasn't emotional. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't revenge fueled by anger. It was something far more dangerous. It was the truth. And the truth was finally ready to be revealed. The invitation arrived 3 days later. Not to me, of course. To investors, board members, business partners, and local media. David was hosting a celebration, a major company event announcing a new expansion project. The kind of event designed to attract attention. Photos, press coverage, public recognition, a victory lap. When Lisa showed me the invitation, I almost laughed. The timing couldn't have been more ironic. For years, David had carefully managed appearances. Now he was about to put all of his most important relationships into one room. Investors, board members, industry leaders, everyone whose trust he depended on. And he was doing it voluntarily. Sometimes people create their own downfall. They just don't realize it. The event was scheduled for a Friday evening at a luxury hotel in downtown Dallas. The ballroom could hold nearly 300 guests. According to Lisa, attendance would be impressive. Several major investors were expected. A few local politicians, business reporters, community leaders, the entire board of directors. Exactly the kind of audience David would want. And exactly the kind of audience that needed to hear the truth. The week leading up to the event felt strangely peaceful. Not because I wasn't nervous. I was. But after years in the army, I'd learned something important. Preparation reduces fear. And we were prepared. Every document had been reviewed. Every statement verified. Every piece of evidence organized. There would be no emotional outburst. No dramatic screaming. No scenes from a television show. Just facts. Carefully documented facts. The kind that are difficult to argue with. Snai. On Friday afternoon, I stood in front of the mirror inside my hotel room. My army dress uniform fit perfectly. The same uniform I had worn at promotion ceremonies, military funerals, retirement celebrations, and official functions across 3 decades. The uniform represented service, duty, integrity, values that had guided my life, values that suddenly felt more important than ever. I adjusted the ribbons above my pocket, smoothed my jacket, and looked at my reflection. The woman staring back looked older than she had 3 weeks earlier, but she also looked stronger. There comes a point when heartbreak stops making you feel small. Instead, it reminds you who you are. That moment had finally arrived. Lisa met me in the hotel lobby. She carried a briefcase. Inside were copies of everything. Financial records, corporate filings, supporting documents, Enough evidence to answer every question that might arise. She smiled. You ready? I thought about it, then nodded. Yes. For the first time since returning home, I truly meant it. The ballroom was already crowded when we arrived. Through the partially open doors, I could hear laughter and conversation, glasses clinking, music playing softly, people celebrating. Inside, David was probably enjoying himself, confident, comfortable, completely unaware of what was about to happen. For a brief moment, I considered turning around, not because I was afraid, because part of me still loved the man I had married. 30 years doesn't disappear overnight. Even after betrayal, even after lies, a small piece of my heart wished none of this had happened. But wishes don't change reality. Truth does. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The room didn't notice me immediately. Why would they? I was simply another guest entering a crowded ballroom. But as I moved farther inside, heads began turning. People noticed the uniform first. Then they noticed me. Several older employees looked confused, as if they recognized something familiar but couldn't quite place it. I continued walking, steady, calm, purposeful, toward the stage, toward David. He was standing near the front of the room holding a champagne glass. Beside him stood Vanessa. She wore an elegant navy blue dress. Around her neck hung the diamond necklace David had given me on our 25th anniversary. The sight still hurt, but not as much as it would have a week earlier. By then I had already accepted the truth. The necklace was merely a symbol. The real betrayal ran much deeper. Then David saw me. I watched the exact moment recognition appeared. His smile vanished. The color drained from his face. The champagne glass froze halfway to his lips. For several seconds he simply stared, as if his mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. Vanessa noticed his reaction. Then she turned, and saw me too. Her expression shifted immediately. Confidence, confusion, fear, all within a few seconds. The room grew quieter. Conversations began fading. People sensed something unusual was happening. I stopped a few feet away, close enough for David to hear every word, far enough to maintain dignity. Neither of us spoke initially. The silence itself was powerful. Finally, I broke it. Hello, David. His mouth opened slightly. No sound emerged. I had seen soldiers react more calmly during emergencies. Oh, a few guests exchanged nervous glances, someone whispered. Who is she? I looked around the room, at the employees, the investors, the board members, the people who deserved honesty. Then I answered the question myself. My name is Rebecca Carter. More silence, I continued. I've been married to David Carter for 30 years. The reaction was immediate. Several people visibly stiffened. Others looked toward Vanessa, then back toward me. Confusion spread through the room, a ripple moving from table to table. I glanced at the necklace, then at Vanessa. I'm also the woman who received that necklace from my husband on our 25th wedding anniversary. Vanessa instinctively touched it, as though suddenly aware everyone was looking. David finally found his voice. Rebecca. It was barely a whisper. I turned toward him. No. My tone remained calm. Tonight isn't about explanations. The room remained completely silent. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. One of the board members approached cautiously. An older gentleman named Robert Simmons. I recognized him from company photographs. Mrs. Carter. Yes, his expression tightened. I think perhaps we should move this discussion somewhere private. I shook my head gently. Ordinarily, I would agree. Then I looked toward the board members seated nearby. But the information I'm about to share affects this company. Robert immediately understood. His face grew serious, very serious. Lisa stepped forward. She opened her briefcase, removed several folders, and handed copies to key board members. The atmosphere changed instantly. This was no longer a personal dispute. This was business. For the next 20 minutes, Lisa calmly presented evidence. Financial transfers, questionable consulting agreements, corporate transactions connected to Vanessa, documentation, dates, amounts, records. No accusations, just facts. The room became quieter with every page. Board members exchanged increasingly concerned looks. Investors began asking questions. The answers were not reassuring. I never raised my voice, never insulted David, never attacked Vanessa. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke far more effectively than anger ever could. One board member removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Another requested immediate access to additional financial records. A third quietly asked corporate counsel to join the discussion. The celebration had transformed into an emergency meeting. David stood frozen through most of it, his carefully constructed image collapsing in real time. Not because I destroyed it, because the truth did. Eventually he looked at me. For the first time all evening I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Not fear of embarrassment. Fear of consequences, real consequences. Professional, financial, legal. Consequences he could no longer avoid. And as I looked around that ballroom I realized something important. This wasn't revenge. Not anymore. Revenge is about making someone suffer. What was happening here was accountability. And accountability had finally arrived. By the end of the evening, the board had scheduled an emergency investigation. Outside auditors would be brought in. Corporate records would be reviewed. Nothing would remain hidden. As guests slowly left the ballroom, I watched David standing alone near the stage. For the first time in 30 years, he looked like a stranger. And deep down, I knew his biggest losses hadn't even begun yet. The investigation began the following Monday. Unlike television dramas, real investigations move slowly. There are no dramatic music cues. No surprise witnesses bursting through doors. Just long hours, documents, interviews, accountants, lawyers, questions, and eventually answers. For the first time since returning home, I checked out of the hotel and rented a small furnished apartment near a lake outside Dallas. I needed distance. Distance from David. Distance from our house. Distance from everything that had once felt familiar. Every morning I would sit on a small balcony with coffee and watch ducks move across the water. It was peaceful, at least on the surface. Inside I still felt like someone rebuilding after a storm. Within 2 weeks, the board suspended David from his leadership position, pending the outcome of the investigation. The announcement made local business news. Several major investors demanded explanations. Some business partners paused negotiations. Others quietly walked away. Trust is difficult to earn, easy to lose, and nearly impossible to recover once people believe you've been dishonest, especially in business. I wasn't attending board meetings, but Lisa kept me informed. The findings grew worse with each report. Some of the financial transfers had violated company policies. Several contracts should never have been approved. Corporate funds had been used in ways that raised serious concerns. While criminal charges were never discussed, civil liability quickly became a possibility. The board's priority was protecting the company. And protecting the company meant protecting it from David. Vanessa disappeared almost immediately. That part surprised me less than anything else. 1 week she was attending charity luncheons and posing for photographs. The next week she was nowhere to be found. No social media updates, no public appearances, no company events. Gone. As if someone had switched off a light. People who had once praised her suddenly avoided mentioning her name. Funny how quickly loyalty changes when money and status disappear. One afternoon I received a call from Jim Harper. "Have you heard? Heard what? Vanessa left town." I wasn't shocked. Where'd she go? No idea. I looked out toward the lake. Do you think she ever loved him? The question surprised even me. Jim was quiet for a moment. Then he answered carefully. I honestly don't know. Neither did I. And strangely enough, it no longer mattered. 3 months after the investigation began, the board reached its decision. David would no longer lead Carter Logistics Solutions. His ownership interests would be significantly reduced under a settlement agreement. Additional legal proceedings would resolve the remaining financial disputes. The company survived, but David's position within it did not. When Lisa called with the news, I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt tired. Very tired. Because the truth is, winning doesn't always feel the way people imagine, especially when the person who loses is someone you once loved. The financial settlement itself was substantial. Years of shared assets, business interests, property, investments, everything had to be divided. The final numbers weren't important to me. Not really. I had spent most of my adult life living comfortably but modestly. The settlement provided security. Nothing more. And honestly, security was enough. At my age, peace mattered more than luxury. Friends wanted me to celebrate. Margaret certainly did. She drove up from San Antonio and insisted on taking me to dinner. Halfway through the meal, she raised a glass. To Rebecca Carter, I laughed. What exactly are we celebrating? You survived. That answer caught me off guard. Margaret smiled. No bitterness, no revenge obsession, no self-destruction. She lifted her glass again. You survived. This time I raised mine too, because maybe she was right. A few weeks later, I received a text message from David. The first direct message since the ballroom. Would you meet me? I stared at the phone for a long time. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Another part knew avoidance wouldn't bring closure. Eventually, I agreed. Oh. We met at a quiet restaurant outside the city. The kind of place where retired couples linger over coffee and nobody pays attention to strangers. When David walked in, I barely recognized him. He looked older. Not physically. Emotionally. The confidence he once carried had disappeared. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. Thank you for coming. I nodded. You're welcome. Then another silence settled between us. 30 years together, and suddenly we felt like strangers. Eventually, he looked down at his hands. I don't know where to start. Start with the truth. His eyes closed briefly. Then he nodded. Fair enough. For the next hour, David told me things I should have heard years earlier. Not excuses. Not justifications. Truth. Or at least what he believed was the truth. He talked about feeling overshadowed. About insecurity. About watching people admire my military career while viewing him simply as my husband. At first, I struggled to understand. Then I remembered something important. Pain doesn't always make people stronger. Sometimes it makes them selfish. I was proud of you, he said quietly. Then why did you mock me? His face tightened. He knew exactly what I meant. Jim's story. The jokes. The comments. David looked ashamed. Because it was easier. Easier than what? Easier than admitting I felt left behind. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he continued. I convinced myself you loved the army more than you loved me. I stared at him. You knew that wasn't true. I know that now. The answer was heartbreaking. Because deep down, I think he knew it then too. Boom. People often imagine betrayal comes from hatred. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it comes from weakness, insecurity, fear. Poor choices repeated over and over until they become something unforgivable. That realization didn't excuse what David had done, but it helped me understand it. And understanding is often the first step toward peace. As lunch ended, David looked at me. There were tears in his eyes. The first I'd seen throughout this entire ordeal. I'm sorry, Rebecca. The words hung in the air. Simple words, late words, but sincere words. I believed that. For a long moment I studied the man sitting across from me. The man I had loved. The man who had broken my heart. The man who had ultimately destroyed his own life far more thoroughly than I ever could have. And for the first time since coming home, I didn't feel anger. I felt sadness. A deep sadness for everything we had lost. Everything we could have been. And everything that would never be again. As we stood to leave, David asked one final question. Do you think you'll ever forgive me? I looked at him carefully, then answered honestly, I don't know. And at that moment, it was the most truthful answer I could give. 6 months after my meeting with David, I officially retired from the United States Army. 32 years. When I first raised my right hand and took the oath, I was 26 years old. I had no idea where life would take me. I certainly never imagined I would end my career as a colonel. And I definitely never imagined I would be retiring while rebuilding my life from the ground up. Life has a way of surprising us. Not always pleasantly, but sometimes the unexpected becomes the beginning of something better. The retirement ceremony was held on a warm spring afternoon. Family, friends, fellow soldiers, former commanders, people from different chapters of my life gathered together. Margaret sat in the front row. Jim was there too. Even Lisa attended. As I looked around the room, I noticed something interesting. For months I had focused on what I had lost. A marriage, a home, a future I thought was guaranteed. But standing there that afternoon, I saw something else. I saw what remained. Friendship, respect, community, purpose. The things that truly matter. The things betrayal cannot take away. After the ceremony, several younger officers approached me. They asked questions about leadership, service, retirement, life after the military. One young captain looked particularly nervous. Ma'am, she said, what's the most important thing you've learned? I smiled. There were hundreds of possible answers, but only one felt right. Never build your entire identity around one person. She nodded thoughtfully. I hoped she understood, because it had taken me nearly 60 years to learn that lesson myself. A few weeks later, I began volunteering with a veterans transition program. The organization helped former service members adjust to civilian life. Many struggled with uncertainty. Some felt lost. Others felt forgotten. I understood those feelings better than I ever expected to. Every Wednesday, I met with veterans looking for jobs, housing, or simply someone willing to listen. The work was meaningful and surprisingly healing. Helping other people reminded me that pain isn't the end of a story. Sometimes it's the beginning of a new chapter. Sue. One afternoon nearly a year after returning home, I received a letter. Not an email, not a text message, a handwritten letter. The envelope carried a familiar name, David Carter. For several minutes I simply stared at it. Then I opened it. The letter was only 3 pages long. There were no excuses, no attempts to justify his choices, no requests to get back together. Just honesty. The kind of honesty that should have existed years earlier. He wrote about regret, about accountability, about therapy, about learning to accept responsibility instead of blaming others. Most importantly, he wrote about gratitude. Gratitude for the years we shared. Gratitude for the sacrifices I made. Gratitude for the life we built before everything fell apart. When I finished reading, I sat quietly for a long time. Then I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Not because I wanted to forget it, because I wanted to remember it. People often ask whether I ever forgave David. The answer is yes. Eventually I did. But probably not for the reason most people expect. I didn't forgive him because he deserved it. Forgiveness isn't a reward. I forgave him because carrying bitterness was exhausting. Anger is heavy. Resentment is heavy. At some point, you realize you're carrying a burden that belongs to someone else, and you finally decide to set it down. That doesn't mean I forgot. It doesn't mean I trusted him again. And it certainly doesn't mean we got back together. We didn't. Some chapters are meant to end. But endings don't have to be cruel. Sometimes they can simply be final. A few months later, David and I met one last time. Not to discuss legal matters. Not to revisit the past. Just coffee. 2 people acknowledging a shared history. Nothing more. We talked about ordinary things. Mutual friends. Retirement. Health. Life. When the conversation ended, neither of us cried. Neither of us argued. We simply wished each other well. And that was enough. Not every story requires a dramatic conclusion. Sometimes peace arrives quietly. Today, as I tell this story, I'm sitting at a community event hosted by the Veterans Organization where I volunteer. Children are playing nearby. Families are gathered around picnic tables. Old soldiers are sharing stories. The sun is beginning to set. It's a good day. A peaceful day. The kind of day I once feared I would never have again. A few years ago, I believed my story was ending. Now I realize it was only changing direction. Looking back, people sometimes describe what happened as revenge. I understand why. There was a public revelation. There were consequences. David lost the company he worked so hard to build. His reputation suffered. His relationship with Vanessa collapsed. From the outside, it probably looks like revenge. But that's not how I see it. The greatest revenge wasn't exposing him. It wasn't winning a settlement. It wasn't watching his lies unravel. The greatest revenge was refusing to let his betrayal define the rest of my life. That's what truly mattered. Because when someone hurts you deeply, there is always a choice. You can spend years living inside that wound. Or you can keep moving forward. Slowly. Painfully. One step at a time. Until the wound becomes a scar. And the scar becomes part of your story instead of your identity. If there's one lesson I hope people take from my experience, it's this. The truth may arrive later than you want. Justice may take longer than you expect. And healing may happen more slowly than you'd like. But none of those things are impossible. As long as you keep going. As long as you keep choosing dignity over bitterness. As long as you remember that another person's betrayal does not determine your worth. See? Thank you for spending this time with me and listening to my story. If this journey reminded you of someone you've loved, forgiven, or lost, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on that person today. And if you've ever faced betrayal and found a way to move forward with grace, know that you're not alone. Feel free to share your thoughts and experiences. Stories have a way of helping us heal together. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about resilience, family, and second chances, I invite you to join us again for another journey. Take care of yourself, and remember sometimes the best years of your life are still waiting ahead. The bank and the police just called. My father's voice exploded through my phone at 6 o'clock in the morning. "What did you do, Sarah?" In the background, I could hear my younger brother Kevin shouting. "Dad, ask her. Ask her what she did." I sat quietly at the small kitchen table in my apartment near Naval Station, Norfolk, stirring a cup of black coffee. Outside, the Virginia sunrise was just beginning to paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. I took a slow sip before answering. "I didn't do anything." "Don't lie to me," my father screamed. "You stole my money." I almost laughed. His money. That was rich. Especially after the text message he had sent me less than 12 hours earlier. The text that changed everything. The text that finally revealed who my father truly was. And the text that ultimately destroyed the carefully constructed lies he'd been living behind for more than 20 years. But to understand why the bank and the police were suddenly interested in Frank Mitchell, you have to understand my family. You have to understand my mother. And you have to understand what happens when a greedy man mistakes kindness for weakness. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 38 years old. I served 20 years in the United States Navy. At the time this story began, I was a commander stationed in Norfolk. I had spent most of my adult life serving my country. Deployments, long separations, missed holidays, missed birthdays. The sacrifices were real. But I never regretted my choice. The Navy taught me discipline, responsibility, patience. 3 qualities that would prove incredibly useful when dealing with my family, especially my father. The trouble started on a Tuesday afternoon. I was finishing paperwork in my office when my phone buzzed. I glanced down. Dad? I hadn't spoken to him in almost 3 months. That wasn't unusual. Our relationship had always been strained. Growing up, my younger brother Kevin was the center of my father's universe. Kevin could do no wrong. If Kevin got a C in school, Dad praised his effort. If I got an A, Dad asked why it wasn't an A+. When Kevin wrecked a truck at 17, Dad called it a mistake. When I came home 15 minutes after curfew at 16, I was grounded for a month. The favoritism wasn't subtle. Everybody saw it. My mother saw it. Our neighbors saw it. Even Kevin saw it. But nobody ever challenged my father, least of all me. By the time I turned 18, I had learned an important lesson. You can't force someone to love you fairly. So I joined the Navy and built my own life. The distance helped, at least most of the time. I looked at the text message. Then I opened it. My stomach immediately tightened. The first line read, "I'm leaving the house, the cars, and everything to your brother." I blinked. Then came the second message. "Oh, and I already emptied the trust fund your mother left you, haha." I stared at the screen. For several seconds I couldn't breathe. Not because of the house. Not because of the cars. I honestly didn't care about those things. But my mother's trust fund. That got my attention. My mother had died 22 years earlier. Breast cancer. She was only 47. I was 16. Kevin was 13. The day before she passed away, she squeezed my hand in her hospital room. She looked weak, fragile, but her eyes were sharp, clear, determined. "Sarah," she whispered, "one day you'll understand why I made certain arrangements." I didn't know what she meant. Not then. Years later, after I joined the Navy, a lawyer contacted me. That's when I learned my mother had created a trust. Most of the details remained confidential. The attorney simply told me that everything was protected, and that my mother had planned carefully. I trusted her, so I never worried about it. Until that text message. I read it 3 times. Then 4. Finally, I replied with a single word. Okay. That was it. No argument, no threats, no anger. Just okay. A few minutes later, another text arrived. "That's all you have to say." I ignored it. Then another. "Your brother deserves it more." Ignored. Then another. "You always thought you were better than us." Ignored. Finally, silence. I slipped the phone into my pocket and went back to work. At 5 o'clock, I drove home. The entire way, memories kept surfacing. My father laughing with Kevin. My father teaching Kevin to drive. My father helping Kevin buy his first business. My father showing up for Kevin's baseball games. I couldn't remember him attending a single event for me. Not one. Even when I graduated from officer candidate school, my mother would have been there, but she was already gone. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment. I opened a small fireproof box I kept in my closet. Inside were old documents, letters, legal papers, and a sealed envelope with my mother's handwriting. I hadn't looked at it in years. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a short note. "Sarah, if you're reading this, someone has probably violated the trust. Don't panic. Everything was designed to protect you. Trust the documents, trust the attorney, and trust yourself. Love always, Mom." I felt tears sting my eyes. Even after 22 years, I still missed her. I missed her wisdom, her warmth, her ability to see through people, especially my father. Beneath the letter sat several legal documents. I reviewed them carefully. Then I noticed something. A clause, a very specific clause. I read it twice, then a third time, and suddenly everything made sense. My father hadn't stolen the trust fund. Not legally. What he had done was much worse. He had triggered protections he didn't even know existed. For the first time all day, I smiled. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted my father to suffer. But because my mother had anticipated this exact situation decades earlier. She knew him. She knew what he was capable of. And she had prepared accordingly. That night I sent a single email. The recipient was my mother's attorney. One sentence. "Please call me regarding the Mitchell Trust." He replied 20 minutes later. "First thing tomorrow morning." I slept peacefully. Meanwhile, several miles away, my father and Kevin were apparently celebrating. They thought they had won. They thought the money was theirs. They thought I was powerless. They had no idea what was about to happen. At exactly 5:47 a.m., my phone rang. "Dad," I answered, and immediately heard panic in his voice. Then came the words that opened this story. "The bank and the police just called." I looked out the window at the rising sun. A new day was beginning, and for the first time in 20 years, the truth was finally catching up with my father. At 7 o'clock that morning, I sat in my apartment with a fresh cup of coffee and waited for the call. My father's frantic messages kept appearing on my phone. "Call me now. This is your doing." They froze my account. Kevin's account too. For the first time in years, I ignored every message. Not out of spite, out of discipline. 20 years in the Navy had taught me something important. When people panic, the worst thing you can do is panic with them. At precisely 7:15, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a familiar name. Robert Hansen, my mother's attorney. He had to be nearly 80 by now. I answered immediately. "Mr. Hansen." "Sarah," he said warmly, "it's been a long time." "It has." There was a brief pause. Then his tone became serious. "I received your email. I figured you would. And I reviewed the trust documents before calling. I already knew what he was going to say. Still, hearing it from him felt different." "Sarah," he said quietly, "your father may have committed a felony." I leaned back in my chair. Outside traffic was beginning to build on the nearby road. For some reason, the ordinary sounds of morning made the conversation feel even more surreal. "Can you explain everything?" I asked. "From the beginning." "Of course." And for the next hour, Robert told me a story I had never fully known. A story about my mother. A story about my father. And a story about how one woman had spent the final months of her life protecting her children from a danger she knew was coming. Years before my mother's cancer diagnosis, my parents had already begun drifting apart. Not publicly, not in a way neighbors could see, but privately. My father had developed habits, bad habits, small gambling trips at first, then larger ones, risky investments, loans, credit card debt, money problems that seemed to appear from nowhere. Whenever my mother confronted him, he always had an explanation. A temporary setback, a misunderstanding, a business opportunity. But the explanations never quite matched reality. One day she started keeping records. Bank statements, credit card statements, loan paperwork. And eventually she discovered something troubling. My father wasn't merely making mistakes. He was hiding things, important things, large things. According to Robert, the discovery frightened her. Not because she was worried about herself, because she was worried about Kevin and me. She knew that if something happened to her, my father would have complete control over the family's finances. And she didn't trust him. That realization led her to create the trust. Not an ordinary trust, a very carefully designed one. As Robert explained the details, I finally understood why the paperwork had always seemed so complicated. My mother had worked with estate planners, financial advisors, tax attorneys, people who specialized in protecting family assets. The trust was designed specifically to prevent misuse. My father had been named a trustee, but only a limited trustee. His authority was restricted. Every major action required compliance with specific legal requirements. Certain transactions triggered automatic reviews. Certain withdrawals required documentation. And certain violations generated mandatory reports. "What exactly happened?" I asked. Robert sighed. "Your father apparently believed he had direct ownership." "He didn't." "No, not even close." I shook my head slowly. My father had always acted as though everything belonged to him. The house, the savings, the investments, even things my mother had purchased herself. Apparently, he had convinced himself that the trust belonged to him too. "How much trouble is he in?" I asked. "That depends. On what? Whether this was ignorance or intentional fraud." I almost laughed. Ignorance wasn't my father's problem. Greed was. After hanging up, I drove to the base. The morning felt strangely peaceful. The Chesapeake Bay shimmered beneath a bright blue sky. Sailboats moved slowly in the distance. For a moment I found myself thinking about my mother again. She loved the water. She used to tell me that the ocean revealed people's character. Storms don't create weakness, she'd say. They reveal it. Back then I never understood what she meant. Now I did. By lunchtime, Kevin finally called. I considered ignoring him. Then I answered. Sarah. His voice sounded nervous. Not angry. Not arrogant. Nervous. What happened? I don't know. Don't do that. I'm serious. Then why did the bank freeze everything? I remained silent. Kevin sighed. For once, can you just talk to me? There was something different in his voice. Something I hadn't heard before. Fear. Not fear of me. Fear of reality. The golden child was finally discovering that being favored doesn't protect you from consequences. Kevin, I said calmly, did Dad tell you where the money came from? What do you mean? The trust money. Mom left it. To who? Silence. Then? I don't know. Exactly. Another long pause followed. I could practically hear him thinking. That alone was unusual. For most of his life, Kevin accepted whatever my father told him. Questioning Dad simply wasn't something he did. At least not until now. Sarah, he finally said, are we in trouble? Interesting. For years, everything had been divided into us and you. Now suddenly it was we. I don't know, Kevin. You're not helping. I can't help if I don't know the facts. That answer frustrated him. But it was honest. After ending the call, I returned to work. The afternoon passed slowly. Meetings. Reports. Routine tasks. Normal life continuing while my family was falling apart. Around 4 o'clock, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from my father. A very different text. No insults, no accusations. Just one sentence. Please call me. I stared at the screen. Growing up, I couldn't remember my father ever saying please to me. Not once. I didn't respond. An hour later, another message arrived. This one from Kevin. Dad's really scared. I set the phone down. For a moment, I felt something unexpected. Sadness. Not satisfaction. Not triumph. Sadness. Because none of this had to happen. My mother had given my father every opportunity, every warning, every chance, and somehow he still chose greed. That evening I returned home and opened the fireproof box again. I studied the documents more carefully. The trust wasn't merely protecting money, it was preserving accountability. My mother had anticipated every possible shortcut, every possible manipulation, every possible betrayal. And she had prepared for them all. Near the bottom of the folder, I discovered another note I had never noticed before. Written in my mother's familiar handwriting were 7 simple words. The truth arrives slowly, but it arrives. I read the sentence 3 times, then I smiled. Because somewhere across town, investigators were already following the truth. And they were finding things my father never expected anyone to see. Just before bed, Robert Hansen called again. His voice sounded graver than before. Sarah. Yes, we received preliminary records. And there was a pause. Then he delivered the news. The investigators found something. What? The money isn't actually gone. I sat upright. What do you mean? They traced most of it. Where? Your father moved it. To where? Robert took a breath, then said the words that changed everything. Into accounts connected to your brother. Suddenly this wasn't just about my father anymore. And for the first time I wondered whether Kevin truly knew what had happened. Or whether he was about to become the second victim of my father's greed. I barely slept that night. Not because I was worried, because I was thinking about Kevin. For most of my life, I'd viewed him as part of the problem. The favored son. The golden child. The one who always received what I never did. But as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I kept asking myself the same question. Did Kevin actually know? Or had Dad used him the same way he'd used everyone else? The next morning, I arrived at Naval Station Norfolk before sunrise. The parking lot was still dark. A cool breeze drifted in from the water. For a few minutes I sat inside my truck and watched the first light appear over the horizon. The Navy teaches you to focus on facts. Not assumptions. Not emotions. Facts. And the fact was simple. I didn't yet know how involved Kevin had been, so I refused to judge him. At least not yet. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when my phone rang. Robert Hansen. Again. Good morning, Sarah. You sound busy. I am. His voice carried an energy I hadn't heard before. Something was moving. Fast. What happened? The bank completed part of its review. I sat down. And they've identified multiple unauthorized transfers. I closed my eyes. There it was. The first real confirmation. Not rumors, not speculation. Evidence. How many transfers? Several. Over what period? Months? That surprised me. Months. I had assumed my father emptied the trust in one dramatic move. Apparently not. According to the bank records, he'd been moving money gradually. Small amounts at first, then larger amounts, always staying below reporting thresholds. Always trying to avoid attention. A strategy that probably would have worked, if not for one thing. Greedy people rarely know when to stop. The text message had triggered everything. His decision to brag about it had created a paper trail nobody could ignore. Robert continued. The investigators are now reviewing additional records. What kind? Property records, tax records, trust documents? I felt a chill. This was growing bigger. Much bigger. Sarah, I need to ask something. Go ahead. Did your father ever pressure you to sign anything? I thought for a moment, then remembered. About 6 years earlier, during a deployment, Dad had called unexpectedly. He wanted me to sign paperwork related to the family house. At the time, he claimed it was routine. I had refused, mostly because I was halfway around the world and didn't like signing documents I hadn't reviewed. He'd been furious. We didn't speak for months afterward. I told Robert about it. His silence lasted several seconds. That's important. Why, we found references to those documents. My stomach tightened. What kind of references? We don't know yet. That answer worried me more than if he had simply told me. Unknown problems are usually worse than known ones. After hanging up, I tried focusing on work. But my mind kept drifting. Back to childhood. Back to family dinners. Back to the countless times Dad praised Kevin while criticizing me. The memories came in waves. One stood out more than the others. I was 18, a week before leaving for Navy boot camp. Mom had already passed away. Dad and Kevin were sitting at the kitchen table. I remember Dad looking directly at me. You'll be back. What? The Navy. I don't think so. He laughed. You won't last 6 months. I lasted 20 years. Funny how life works. Around noon, my phone buzzed. Kevin, I answered. His voice sounded exhausted. Sarah, what's going on? Dad's losing it. I didn't respond. He keeps saying the bank made a mistake. Did they? No. That single word caught my attention. No. No. His voice cracked slightly. For the first time in my life, Kevin sounded defeated. I saw some of the records, and he lied. I leaned back in my chair. What did you find? More silence. Then, the transfers. My heart sank. Not because I was shocked, because I wasn't. Part of me had expected this. What about them? They went into accounts connected to me. I waited. I didn't know. There it was. The sentence I'd been wondering about. The question that had kept me awake. Kevin continued speaking. Fast now. Like someone trying to empty years of confusion. I swear, Sarah, I didn't know where the money came from. Dad told me it was part of Mom's estate. He said she wanted me to have it. I closed my eyes. Of course he did. That's exactly what Dad would say. The problem with lifelong favoritism is that eventually the favored child starts believing it. Kevin wasn't just spoiled. He'd been conditioned, manipulated, used. The realization made me sad. Not angry. Sad. Kevin. Yeah. Do you believe him now? No. The answer came immediately, without hesitation. No, I don't. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he asked something unexpected. Did Mom really leave that money to you? The question hurt more than it should have, because it revealed something. Even after all these years, he genuinely didn't know our mother's wishes. He'd spent so much time listening to Dad that he'd never learned who Mom really was. Kevin. Yeah. Mom loved us both. I know. Then start there. He didn't answer, but I could hear him breathing, thinking. Maybe for the first time in years. That afternoon brought another surprise. A detective called me directly. Nothing dramatic. Nothing like television. Just a calm professional conversation. He explained that investigators were gathering information, reviewing documents, establishing timelines, following procedures, the ordinary mechanics of accountability. Before ending the call, he said something that stuck with me. Most financial cases aren't solved by brilliant detectives. They're not. No. How are they solved? People get greedy. I almost laughed. That certainly described my father. By evening, news had begun spreading through our hometown. Small towns have their own communication systems. Church groups, coffee shops, neighbors talking across fences. People notice things, and people talk. Apparently, word of the frozen accounts was already circulating. Dad hated that. For years, he'd cared deeply about appearances. Now, appearances were slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. When I arrived home, another surprise awaited me. A voicemail. Dad. I almost deleted it. Instead, I listened. His voice sounded older, smaller, not angry, not arrogant, just scared. Sarah. A long pause. Then, I think I made a mistake. I stared at the phone. For nearly 40 years, those might have been the hardest words my father had ever spoken. Not because they fixed anything. They didn't. But because they represented the first crack in the wall he'd spent decades building. I saved the message, then set the phone aside. A few minutes later, Robert called again. Sarah, you have news. I do. Good news or bad news? Interesting news. I smiled. Let's hear it. The investigators completed another review, and they traced most of the missing trust funds. I sat forward. All of them. Nearly all. Can they recover it? Most likely. Relief washed over me. Not because of the money. Because of what the money represented. My mother's wishes. Her legacy. Her faith in me. Robert continued. There's something else. What? The investigators found additional documents. What kind? His voice grew serious. The house. I froze. What about it? The ownership records don't match what your father has been claiming for years. For a moment, the room felt completely silent. Then Robert delivered the sentence that changed everything. The house may not belong to your father at all. For several seconds after Robert ended the call, I simply sat there. The house may not belong to your father at all. The sentence echoed through my mind. Growing up, that house had been the center of our world. A white 2-story home outside Richmond. A wraparound porch. An old oak tree in the front yard. A vegetable garden my mother loved. Every Christmas. Every birthday. Every family memory seemed connected to that place. And now I was learning that my father may have spent years pretending he owned something that legally wasn't his. I called Robert back immediately. What exactly did you find? The deed history. And it appears your mother made changes shortly before her death. I felt my pulse quicken. What kind of changes? Complicated ones. Try me. Robert chuckled softly. You always did sound like your mother. I smiled despite myself. Mom had been the calm one. The planner. The person who thought 3 moves ahead. Dad reacted. Mom prepared. The property was placed into a trust structure. Before she died, yes. And Dad knew? That's the interesting part. The silence that followed answered the question before Robert spoke. He probably never fully understood what she did. That sounded exactly like my father. He hated paperwork, ignored legal details, signed documents without reading them. Meanwhile, Mom read everything. Twice. Sometimes 3 times. I remembered countless evenings watching her sit at the dining room table with stacks of papers spread around her. At the time, I thought she was simply organized. Now I realized she was protecting us, even from things we didn't yet understand. After ending the call, I sat quietly in my office. Outside my window, sailors moved between buildings. Vehicles came and went. The base operated with its usual efficiency. Normal life, steady life, the kind of life I'd built for myself. A life completely separate from family drama. Yet somehow the past had found me anyway. Around noon, Kevin called. This time I answered immediately. His voice sounded different. Not fearful. Not defensive. Tired. Deeply tired. Sarah. Hi. I found something. I leaned back. What? Dad's office. That got my attention. My father had a small office attached to the family house. For years, nobody was allowed inside. Even Kevin rarely entered. What did you find? Boxes. What kind of boxes? Records. My stomach tightened. Financial records? Yeah. He laughed bitterly. Lots of them. For the next 15 minutes, Kevin described what he'd discovered. Bank statements, loan documents, tax notices, past due notices, letters from attorneys, documents stretching back years, some over a decade old. My father had kept everything, and hidden everything. The picture that emerged wasn't pretty. His financial problems had started long before Mom died, long before I joined the Navy, long before Kevin became the golden child. The debt, the bad investments, the gambling losses, the borrowing. It had all been there, waiting beneath the surface, like a crack in a dam, slowly growing larger. waiting for the day everything would break. Sarah. Yeah. I think Mom knew. The sadness in his voice caught me off guard. I think she knew all of it. I looked out the window. A transport aircraft moved slowly across the sky. She probably did. Kevin was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, why didn't she leave him? The question lingered. I honestly didn't know. Maybe she hoped he'd change. Maybe she wanted to protect us. Maybe she loved him despite his flaws. Life is rarely simple, especially marriages that last decades. I don't know, Kevin. Neither do I. Another silence. Then, can I ask you something? Sure. Did you hate me growing up? I wasn't expecting that. Of all the questions he could have asked, that wasn't one of them. I thought carefully before answering. No. Really? But Dad always... I know what Dad always said. Kevin stopped talking. I continued. I was angry sometimes. Okay. I was hurt sometimes. Okay. But I never hated you. His breathing grew heavier. Emotional. Controlled, but emotional. Because I think I hated you. The honesty stunned me. Not because it was cruel. Because it was vulnerable. Kevin had spent his entire life playing a role. The favorite son. The chosen child. The winner. Now the mask was finally coming off. Why? I asked gently. He laughed. A sad laugh. Because Dad made everything a competition. I closed my eyes. There it was. The truth. Not just about money. Not just about inheritance. About family. Dad hadn't simply favored Kevin. He had divided us. Every compliment given to Kevin came with criticism of me. Every success I achieved became proof that I thought I was better. Every disagreement became a battle. And children believe what they're taught. Especially when they're young. Especially when the lessons come from a parent. I thought Mom loved you more. The confession broke my heart. Because I'd spent years believing the opposite. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Kevin quietly said, maybe Dad lied to both of us. I stared at the floor. Maybe... Number. He definitely had. Later that evening, Kevin drove to Norfolk. The trip took nearly 2 hours. When he arrived, I barely recognized him. Not physically. Emotionally. He looked exhausted. Older. As though the previous week had aged him years. In his hands, he carried a large cardboard box. What's that? He set it carefully on my kitchen table. I found it in the attic. I opened the lid. My breath caught. Letters. Dozens of them. Some addressed to Kevin. Some addressed to me. Some addressed to Dad. Every single one written in Mom's handwriting. For a moment, neither of us moved. It felt as though she were standing in the room with us. Kevin picked up one envelope. His hands were shaking. I haven't read any. Neither have I. Maybe we should. I nodded slowly. The first letter I opened was addressed to me. Inside was a message written just months before her death. The words were unmistakably hers. Warm, wise, loving. And as I read, tears filled my eyes, not because of what she wrote about me, but because of what she wrote about Kevin. She loved him. Deeply. Completely. Exactly as much as she loved me. The same truth appeared in letter after letter. There had never been a favorite child. Not for Mom, only for Dad. By the time we finished reading several letters, the sun had disappeared. Darkness filled the apartment. Kevin sat quietly across from me. His eyes red. His face pale. Years of assumptions were collapsing around him. Finally, he looked up. Sarah. Yeah. I owe you an apology. I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. Not tonight. Not while both of us were still trying to process everything. So I simply nodded. We'll talk. He nodded back. Then reached into the box. There's one more thing. What? A letter. To who? He handed it to me. The envelope was sealed. Across the front in my mother's handwriting were 6 words. For Frank. Open only when everything falls apart. And suddenly I realized my mother had been preparing for this moment all along. The envelope sat in the middle of my kitchen table. Neither Kevin nor I touched it. For several minutes we simply stared at it. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Outside, a few cars passed on the street below. Ordinary sounds. Normal sounds. The kind of sounds that somehow felt strange when your entire understanding of your family was changing. Kevin finally broke the silence. Do you think she knew this would happen? I looked down at the envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable. Careful. Neat. Deliberate. My mother's handwriting. The handwriting of a woman who never wasted words. I think she hoped it wouldn't happen. Kevin nodded. Yeah. But I think she prepared just in case. That sounded more like Mom. She wasn't cynical. She wasn't suspicious. But she was realistic. When cancer entered her life, she had faced it directly. When financial problems appeared, she addressed them. When she saw weaknesses in people she loved, she didn't pretend those weaknesses didn't exist. She planned around them. That was her gift. Finally, I picked up the envelope. The paper felt fragile. 22 years old. Yet somehow still carrying her presence. Kevin swallowed hard. Should we? I nodded. Carefully, I opened it. Inside was a 4-page handwritten letter. At the top were the words, Frank. I took a deep breath and began reading aloud. The first page wasn't angry. That surprised me. After everything we had learned, I expected anger. Instead, the letter was filled with sadness. My mother wrote about the early years of their marriage. The small apartment where they started. The old pickup truck they couldn't afford to repair. The nights they sat together dreaming about the future. The years when they were partners. Real partners. As I read, I realized something that had never occurred to me before. My father hadn't always been the man I knew. At some point, something had changed. Or perhaps something hidden had slowly grown stronger. The second page became more difficult. Mom wrote about trust. Not money. Trust itself. The kind that holds families together. The kind that disappears one small decision at a time. She described discovering financial secrets. Hidden debts. Broken promises. Conversations that never happened because my father refused to have them. Yet even then she wasn't cruel. Not once. Instead, she wrote something that made both Kevin and me sit silently for nearly a minute. Frank, I never feared losing money. I feared losing you to your pride. I looked up from the page. Kevin was staring at the table. His eyes glistened. I understood why. The sentence felt painfully true. For years, Dad had chosen pride over honesty. Pride over accountability. Pride over family. And now everything was collapsing because of it. I continued reading. The third page addressed Kevin and me. Not directly, but through Dad. Frank, if you're reading this, then our children are probably hurting. Please remember that they are not opponents. They are not competitors. They are brother and sister. Don't make them carry burdens that belong to us. Kevin covered his eyes with one hand. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he whispered, She knew. I nodded. She knew. Mom had seen exactly what was happening. The divisions, the comparisons, the favoritism, the damage. And she'd understood the cost long before either of us did. The final page was the hardest. Because it wasn't written for us. It was written for him. Frank, if everything has fallen apart, then something went very wrong. Maybe you ignored advice. Maybe you believed you could fix things later. Maybe you convinced yourself that nobody would ever know. But truth has a way of surviving. And when it arrives, I hope you choose honesty. Not for me. Not for yourself. For Sarah and Kevin. Please don't leave them fighting over things that never mattered as much as they do. I hope one day you value your family more than your pride. Love. Margaret. When I finished reading, the apartment felt impossibly quiet. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. 22 years had passed since Mom wrote those words. And somehow they described our current situation perfectly. Finally, Kevin wiped his eyes. I spent my whole life believing Dad. I didn't answer. Because there wasn't really anything to say. He continued. I thought he favored me because I deserved it. His voice cracked. I thought you were distant because you wanted to be. I looked at him. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking at the golden child. I was looking at my little brother. The same kid who used to chase fireflies in the backyard. The same kid who cried when Mom died. The same kid who had spent years trapped inside a story somebody else created. I'm sorry, Sarah. The words came quietly, sincerely. No excuses, no qualifications. Just an apology. And somehow that made it more powerful. I should have asked questions. I nodded. Maybe I should have defended you. Maybe I should have called more. That one made me smile. Definitely. For the first time that evening, Kevin laughed. A real laugh. Small, but real. The tension eased. Not completely. Some wounds take years to heal. But it was a beginning. The next morning brought another development. Robert Hansen called again. The legal process was moving quickly. Much more quickly than my father expected. The trust funds were being recovered. The unauthorized transfers had been documented. The property records were being reviewed. And prosecutors were evaluating their options. The reality was becoming impossible for Dad to ignore. By afternoon, Kevin received a call from him. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. When Kevin hung up, he looked shaken. What happened? He cried. I stared. What? He cried. I had never seen my father cry. Not when Mom died. Not when he lost businesses. Not when relatives passed away. Never. Yet apparently he was crying now. What did he say? Kevin sat down. He said he doesn't know how everything got this bad. I closed my eyes. The sad part was that I believed him. Not because he was innocent. Because self-deception becomes powerful over time. People tell themselves stories. Then they tell those stories for so many years that eventually they believe them. Dad probably genuinely didn't understand how he ended up here. He simply couldn't see the thousands of choices that led him to this moment. That evening another call came. This one directly from Dad. I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead I answered. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then I heard something I never expected. Fear. Not fear of prison. Not fear of money. Fear of losing his family. Sarah. His voice sounded older than I remembered. Smaller. We need to talk. I stared out the window. The sunset painted the sky orange and gold. For years, I had imagined this moment. A confrontation. An apology. An explanation. Now that it was finally here, I felt surprisingly calm. When? I asked. A long silence followed. Then my father answered. Whenever you're ready. And for the first time in decades, I heard humility in his voice. Real humility. Not performance. Not manipulation. Something genuine. Something my mother had waited years to hear. Something that might have arrived too late. Or perhaps just in time. 3 days later, I drove to Richmond. The meeting place surprised me. Dad hadn't chosen a lawyer's office. He hadn't chosen a restaurant. He hadn't chosen the family house. He chose the cemetery. Specifically my mother's gravesite. The moment Kevin told me where Dad wanted to meet, I understood why. There are some places where people find it harder to lie. This was one of them. The afternoon was warm. A light breeze moved through the trees. Birds chirped somewhere nearby. The cemetery looked peaceful, almost timeless. Kevin arrived first. Then me. Dad came last. For a moment, I barely recognized him. In less than 2 weeks, he seemed to have aged 10 years. His shoulders were slumped. His hair looked grayer. The confidence that had defined him for decades was gone. Not diminished. Gone. We stood silently beside Mom's headstone. No one spoke. No one seemed to know where to begin. Finally, Dad looked down at the engraved letters bearing her name. Then he spoke. I should have listened to her. His voice cracked. The words hung in the air. Simple. Honest. Painful. Nobody interrupted. For nearly a minute, he simply stood there staring at the stone. Then he looked at me. I'm sorry, Sarah. I waited. Not because I wanted him to suffer. Because apologies matter. And real apologies require truth. He continued. I stole from the trust. There it was. No excuses, no explanations, no blaming lawyers, no blaming banks. Just truth. I kept telling myself I'd put it back. His eyes filled with tears. I always thought I'd fix everything before anybody noticed. I nodded slowly, because that was exactly how many bad decisions happen. Not through evil. Through rationalization. One compromise. Then another. Then another. Until eventually a person wakes up surrounded by consequences. Dad took a deep breath. I favored Kevin. Kevin looked down. Dad continued. I told myself I was helping him. His voice broke. But I wasn't helping him. He turned toward my brother. I was hurting both of you. For the first time, Kevin began crying openly. Not dramatic tears. The quiet tears of a grown man finally confronting reality. I know, Kevin whispered. Dad wiped his eyes. Then he looked back at me. I was proud of you. The sentence surprised me. For a moment, I genuinely thought I'd misheard him. What? I was proud of you. His voice trembled. The Navy. The promotions. The deployments. Everything. I stared at him. Anger would have been easier. Resentment would have been easier. But confusion, that was harder. If you were proud of me, I asked quietly, why did you spend 20 years acting like you weren't? The question landed heavily. Dad looked away. Toward the trees. Toward the sky. Anywhere but at me. Finally he answered. Because every time I looked at you... He stopped. Swallowed hard. Then continued. You reminded me of your mother. The answer hit me like a wave. Not because it excused anything. It didn't. But suddenly I understood something. Mom had been organized. Disciplined. Responsible. Everything Dad struggled to be. And every time he looked at me, he saw those same qualities. Instead of inspiring him, they reminded him of his failures. So he pushed me away. It was a terrible choice. A selfish choice. But it finally made sense. Nobody spoke for several moments. Then Kevin quietly said, "Mom would have hated this." We all smiled sadly. Because it was true. She would have hated every part of it. The lies, the fighting, the division, the greed, everything. A week later, the legal matters were finalized. The results were serious, but fair. Most of the trust funds were recovered. The remaining amounts were repaid through negotiated settlements. The property records were corrected. Ownership issues were resolved. Several transactions were reversed. Most importantly, prosecutors agreed that full cooperation and restitution made criminal prosecution unnecessary. Dad still faced consequences, financial consequences, professional consequences, personal consequences, but he wasn't sent to prison. And honestly, by that point, prison wasn't what I wanted. Accountability mattered. Justice mattered. But destruction didn't. Mom had never wanted destruction. She wanted truth. Weeks later, the family house was sold. Not because anyone forced it. Because all three of us agreed. The place carried too much history. Too much pain. Too many memories. The proceeds were distributed according to the trust. Fairly. Legally. Exactly as Mom intended. For the first time in my life, fairness entered the conversation. Not favoritism. Not manipulation. Fairness. Months passed. Life slowly settled. Dad downsized into a smaller home. Kevin returned to work. I continued serving in Norfolk. Something unexpected happened during those months. We started talking. Not about money. Not about legal cases. About ordinary things. Baseball. Weather. Family recipes. Stories about Mom. The kinds of conversations normal families have. One Sunday afternoon, nearly a year after the text message that started everything, Kevin and Dad drove to Norfolk for dinner. Nothing special. Just dinner. We sat around my table laughing about old stories. At one point, Dad looked around the room, then quietly smiled. "You know something?" "What?" Kevin asked. Dad shook his head. "I almost lost all of this." Nobody responded. Because we all knew he wasn't talking about money. He was talking about us. The family he'd nearly destroyed. The family that somehow survived. Not perfectly. Not magically. But honestly, after they left that evening, I stood alone on my apartment balcony. The sun was setting over the water. Golden light reflected across the bay. For a long time I thought about Mom. About her trust. About her letters. About her wisdom. The greatest gift she left wasn't money. It wasn't property. It wasn't legal protection. It was perspective. She understood something many people never learn. Money reveals character. It doesn't create it. Greed reveals itself. Integrity reveals itself. Love reveals itself. Eventually, the truth reveals itself too. My father learned that lesson the hard way. My brother learned it painfully. And I learned something as well. Forgiveness isn't pretending something never happened. Forgiveness is choosing not to let the worst chapter become the entire story. If you've ever experienced favoritism, betrayal, or family conflict, I hope this story reminds you that accountability and compassion can exist together. Sometimes people deserve consequences. Sometimes people deserve second chances. And occasionally, if they're willing to tell the truth, they deserve both. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to think about the people you love. Life moves faster than we realize. Conversations left undone can become regrets. And forgiveness offered today may become tomorrow's greatest gift. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you'd like to hear more stories about family resilience, justice, and second chances, I'd be honored if you shared this story with someone who might need it and joined us again for another journey. Until next time, take care of yourself and the people who matter most.